Welcome to this preview video. This is lecture 28, chapter 19 and 20. We're going to cover reproduction, fertilization, and pregnancy. These are the learning objectives that we'll cover. It'll be an introduction and we'll go into more detail in class. So we're going to start with methods of contraception, which are basically birth control methods to prevent pregnancy. Let's start off with permanent versions of birth control or contraception. The first one is vasectomy, and we talked about that. That's cutting the vas deferens or the ductus deferens and then sewing up the end. So basically, in this case, you still have semen made by the prostate and the seminal vesicles, and you just won't have the sperm, since the sperm have to travel up the ductus deferens or vas deferens to the ejaculatory duct to be added to the semen. So in this case, it is actually sort of reversible, but it is permanent if left in place. The female equivalent would be tubal ligation, or tying the tubes, the fallopian tubes, again cutting and suturing them. Obviously, it's much easier to do vasectomy since you have access through the scrotum, as compared to in the female you'd need access through the abdomen. Okay, so visualization of that, again, cutting through the scrotum, suturing off that ductus deferens or vas deferens in the vasectomy. Sperm can't make it up to be added to the seminal or semen secretions from the seminal vesicles and prostate. So ejaculate would have no sperm. Similar in the female, the tying off the fallopian tubes in tubal ligation, the oocyte could be ovulated, but the sperm just won't have any access. Once they get up into the uterus, they won't be able to allow for fertilization. Condoms, so these would be less permanent options. Condoms are obviously a barrier. The good thing about condoms is not only do they prevent pregnancy, but they decrease the risk of sexually transmitted infections. IUDs are intrauterine devices that can be placed inside the uterus of the female. So here we can see the vagina with the uterus. And the typical IUD can be placed right in there, and there are strings that actually suspend down into the vagina so it can be checked or removed. One popular IUD actually secretes low levels of progesterone, and those low levels of progesterone prevent, if there ever is an oocyte that's fertilized, prevent implantation in the uterus by changing sort of the receptivity of the uterine lining, the endometrium, to that implantation. And also the progesterone changes the cervical mucus so that there isn't as much access of sperm to make it through the cervical canal. Probably doesn't really affect ovulation since the local levels of progesterone are in the uterus. But in any rate, and it can be removed, and in that case these things would go away, and pregnancy would be possible after that. What about the birth control pill? I'm just going to talk about one example of a birth control pill that's made of mostly progesterone and a tiny little bit of estrogen. That's a popular version. Orthotricycline is an example of a progesterone estrogen mixed pill. So remember, in the female reproductive cycle, GnRH stimulates FSH, stimulates follicles to develop. You get lots of estrogen. At day 14, there's a surge in LH, and that surge in LH triggers ovulation of the dominant follicle, and that oocyte then is available for fertilization. So remember, you need an LH surge to cause ovulation. And then we have the corpus luteum. Those leftover follicular cells produce lots and lots of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. The progesterone also negatively feeds back and decreases GnRH and FSH and LH during that part of the female cycle. So how does the pill work? Well, again, in the pill, you're taking mostly progesterone with also small amounts of estrogen, and that progesterone then it affects the regular cycle and the regular hormonal axis, suspending or decreasing GnRH levels, decreasing FSH levels, preventing that increase in LH that's needed for ovulation. So these pills then block ovulation by affecting the hormone levels. It also affects the uterus by increasing the cervical mucus and causing it to thicken so that sperm have less access to the cervical canal. And so again, between blocking ovulation and blocking the cervix, that's pretty much what you need to reduce the risk of pregnancy. It might also affect implantation as well, if anything did actually get fertilized. So that's an example of the birth control pill. Basically, it's a hormonal pill that reduces the risk of pregnancy. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, some of the pills actually increase risk of some medical conditions. So, for example, being over 35 years of age and also being a smoker and taking the pill can increase a person's risk of stroke. So pills aren't for everybody. And there's also progesterone-only pills as well. Pills are most effective if they're taken at the same time of day, and they also have to be taken every day. So obviously, for the pill to be effective, you have to take it every day, but you also have to take it at the same time for it to be most effective. Okay, I just wanted to mention, you might have heard of Plan B as an example of an emergency contraceptive, and actually it's very similar to the birth control pills in that it has lots of progesterone. Now, it has higher doses than the typical birth control pill, so maybe like 3 or 4 of your birth control pills together might be the same dose. It works through the same mechanisms. You can't be pregnant already, but if you haven't become pregnant, it can certainly reduce the chances of you becoming pregnant by the same mechanisms as the birth control pill. Other devices for contraception include implants. The implants make some sort of synthetic version of progesterone, like progestin, and it's secreted at very constant levels. And again, it works very similar to the pill. You just don't have to take that pill every day because it's implanted under your skin, and you have those constant levels of progesterone, similar to the pill, just without taking the pill. And it obviously lasts for months or years depending on what implant you have. The progesterone, again, goes to affects the uterus and affects the ovaries. The way it affects ovulation is by blocking GnRH and LH secretion from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and it also affects the cervical mucus so that sperm has less access. So sort of the common theme there are the mechanisms that these all work through with high levels of progesterone. Is there a male birth control pill? There's certainly research. So on the horizon is potentially a male pill. Some people have researched testosterone, progesterone in males, anything to shut down male sperm production that would hopefully be temporary. So that's the goal of a male pill. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about sexual function in males and females. In the male, we talk about erection and ejaculation, which coincides with orgasm. In the female, sexual function would be orgasm, but also erectile function as well, since the female has erectile tissue similar to the penis. So we'll cover a little bit about the mechanisms of sexual function. It involves the autonomic nervous system. It also involves the somatic nervous system, both afferent and efferent pathways and signals. The autonomic nervous system controls things like glands and smooth muscle and those reproductive organs. The somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscle associated with the penis, clitoris, and pelvic floor. And of course, you have lots and lots of sensory neurons that originate in the things like the penis and the skin and the clitoris that send pleasurable signals back up to the brain via the spinal cord. So again, the autonomic nervous system involves signals from our brain and our spinal cord to our reproductive tract, and somatic nervous system more so going to the skeletal muscle, the pelvic floor. Let's look at some mechanisms of penile erection, and most of these would apply to female erectile tissue as well, which we'll cover. So erection is a neurovascular event, and what do we mean by that? Well, neurons innervate the penis, and they innervate this vascular tissue, which comes in sort of 3 bundles: the corpora cavernosa, or corpus cavernosum singular, and the corpus spongiosum. And those parasympathetic neurons, autonomic neurons that cause erection, are parasympathetic neurons. They release nitric oxide, which increases blood flow. So it basically opens up the erectile tissue, which is smooth muscle and endothelial cells, and causes increased blood flow. That causes the penis to become erect and rigid. And again, that spongy tissue, that spongy vascular tissue, expands against the rigid tunica albuginea. Viagra, you probably heard of Viagra, and Cialis work through increasing nitric oxide levels in the penis, which increase blood flow only when you're sexually stimulated by those nerves, and that increases the chances for an erection and the ability to maintain an erection. So what happens when the penis is flaccid? Those parasympathetic neurons are not releasing NO. Decreased blood flow in those spongy tissues. The blood flow goes down. There's also sympathetic neurons which innervate those same vascular structures and release norepinephrine. So the combination of norepinephrine and low nitric oxide cause that to be constricted and so cause a flaccid penis. In the female also has erectile function, and it's the clitoris, which is sort of the female equivalent of the corpora cavernosa. There's also the bulb of the vestibule, which surrounds the labia or embedded within the labia, which all of that stuff is innervated by the same parasympathetic type of neurons, releasing nitric oxide, increasing blood flow to those tissues, cause those tissues to enlarge and engorge and become more sensitive. And so that would be the female equivalent of erectile function. Obviously, in orgasm in the male and female, a lot of it has to do with sensory fibers that are sent from the skin or underlying structures back to the brain. And so, again, the clitoris and the penis are sort of male and female equivalents. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's skeletal muscle associated with the clitoris and the penis and the pelvic floor, and those skeletal muscles will contract rhythmically during orgasm, as well as smooth muscle located in the reproductive organs. All of those contractions are initiated by the autonomic nervous system or the somatic nervous system. So here's sort of a summary slide about sexual function, and it's controlled. Again, the parasympathetic nervous system dominates erectile function and increased blood flow to your reproductive organs in the male and female. Ejaculation in the male is really a complex coordination between the sympathetic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system causes smooth muscle to contract in things like the ductus deferens and the glands to cause ejaculation, but you also have somatic neurons which activate the pelvic floor. So here in the diagram you can see some of the structures that contain smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle will help promote ejaculation. But also, in addition to that, there's so the smooth muscle in those reproductive organs, prostate, vesicles, and ductus deferens. In the female as well, there's smooth muscle in the vagina and smooth muscle in the uterus, and again during orgasm those will contract rhythmically. Some people report that helps transport the sperm up towards the fallopian tubes, and of course there's skeletal muscle in the pelvic floor that rhythmically contract as well during orgasm. So very similar between males and females, with the male, of course, having the added component of ejaculation. Okay, are we done yet? Not quite. I wanted to cover a little bit as an introduction about fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy, and we'll talk more detail about this actually in class, since these are sort of big topics. So a little bit and then we'll be done. So the introduction here, we'll start with fertilization, cover a little bit about implantation, and then pregnancy. So it starts off with an oocyte, right? We know that's been ovulated in the fallopian tube. We have a sperm, and literally millions are deposited in the vagina, but only maybe hundreds or thousands can actually reach the area of fertilization. So spermatozoan, really we just call them sperm. They join together, the oocyte and the sperm. The sperm donates half of the genetic material, and together the oocyte and the sperm create a single cell called a zygote. Again, the mom donates 23 chromosomes, the dad 23 chromosomes. Eventually that single cell zygote will actually be all the cells that create you. Again, where does fertilization occur? Ovulation occurs in that ovary. That oocyte with some of the support cells around it make its way into the fallopian tubes. Meanwhile, the sperm make it through the cervical canal after being deposited in the vagina, begin transport all the way up to that fallopian tube, and somewhat near the ovary in the fallopian tube is where fertilization typically takes place. Again, the timing for fertilization takes place. You have to have sperm in a narrow window around ovulation, which happens about day 14 mid-cycle. So you probably decrease your chances of pregnancy if sperm aren't around in that small window of ovulation. So again, we have our single cell that was created, the zygote, Eventually, those cells begin dividing and dividing and dividing as they travel through the fallopian tubes and into the uterine lumen. And then finally, we have a structure called the blastocyst. If you want to think of the blastocyst, just think of it like a ball of cells. That ball of cells will implant into the wall of the uterus and into the endometrium. And that blastocyst eventually will give rise to everything that we need to make the embryo, as well as the placenta, along with some of the mom's uterine tissue. So it takes about 6 to 8 days after this initial fertilization for implantation. Once implantation occurs, this hormone called HCG is made. HCG is sort of like the hormone that signals to your body that you're pregnant, and mainly HCG targets the ovary and the corpus luteum. It tells the ovary and the corpus luteum to continue making progesterone and estrogen, and that continues to keep your uterus in a state that will maintain the implantation and the pregnancy. Okay, so HCG is critical, and you can test for that in your urine and in your blood and tell if you're pregnant. So again, HCG is needed to signal to that corpus luteum. Again, HCG is the hormone that these various urine tests for pregnancy are looking for, as well as blood tests as well. HCG is necessary to keep that ovary producing hormones. If you don't make HCG because you're not pregnant, then eventually that little corpus luteum degrades and dies in the ovary. It's sort of programmed at day 28 or so to die. When it dies off, those cells die off, you stop making progesterone and you stop making estrogen, and in that case, the uterine lining in the uterus will degrade, and you'll undergo menstruation, and you'll have the menses, which is part of that endometrium wall, and as well blood. So some people would call that their period. So again, that happens if you're not pregnant. If you're pregnant, you're going to continue making HCG. That's going to continually tell your ovary to continue to make progesterone and estrogen, and it'll keep that uterine lining from degrading, and you'll no longer have menstruation, and you'll stop your menstrual cycle, and you won't have your period when you're pregnant. Okay, so that's the basic steps of implantation. So remember, we have that blastocyst group of cells implants in the wall of the uterus there. That has all the cells we need to make the embryo, which becomes you, the placenta, which helps support you. Eventually that embryo goes on to become the fetus. For about the first third of pregnancy, you need that corpus luteum to make hormones, but eventually the placenta matures and takes over hormone production, and you no longer need the corpus luteum in the ovary. So what is the placenta for? And you can see the placenta here growing in the wall of the uterus, supporting the growing fetus or embryo. And the placenta is an exchange organ. It makes hormones, it exchanges nutrients and waste products between the mom's blood and the baby's blood. They don't mix the blood, but they come in very close contact. And so just like in the lung and capillaries we've learned in the body, you can exchange nutrients like glucose and oxygen and hormones and waste products. So again, imagine that little thing is growing and developing inside the wall of the uterus. And I just showed some pictures here. There's the baby that's almost full term inside the uterus. I think usually the placenta is more on the posterior wall, but you can also see these twins over here with the placenta still connected to the umbilical cord. So remember, the umbilical cord carries blood to and from the placenta. And of course, the mom sends her own blood from the uterus to the placenta as well. So you can see the two cords for these twins that are connected up to the same placenta. So remember, we start off, sperm and oocyte create that zygote. After about a week, that blastocyst, that ball of cells, implants, and then you have an embryo that's forming in the wall of the uterus, and eventually you have a fetus, 9 weeks to birth, about 40 weeks. We consider that a fetus, and then of course once you're born, you're a baby. And also don't forget that placenta also has to detach and come out as well. It usually follows the baby. Okay, so are we done yet? I think so. That's all we're going to cover for an introduction. That is the end, and that is your last lecture and your last preview video. So hopefully you're happy. We'll see you in class. We'll cover a little bit more about these topics. See you.